And now I am going to stop sharing my slide, and I am going to invite our wonderful moderator from PrEP4All, Michael Chansley, to go ahead and get us started on our content today. Go ahead, Michael.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you for the amazing playlist. It was a good way to get the energy up to get started. uh, so just going to do a brief introduction. So PrEP4All has been holding Big Pharma accountable since the early days of our hashtag Break the Patent campaign, all the way to even with our infamous COVID-19 vaccines bones protests. I'm sure a lot of people saw those viral pictures. And a big part of why we're able to hold Big Pharma accountable with the work that we do is because we do not take pharma funding to do any of our advocacy work. That's why we're proud to be one of the leading organizations that's pressured the Department of Justice to hold Gilead accountable in the U.S. versus Gilead case, which we'll learn more today about from our panelists, as well as our advocacy towards a national PrEP program and to the hashtag Save HIV funding in the face of severe budget cuts to HIV as proposed by Republicans in Congress. So today you will hear from Christopher Morton, JD, PhD, and who is an associate clinical professor of law at Columbia Law School and founding director of Columbia's Science, Health, and Information Clinic. Chris and his clinic legally represent PrEP4All pro bono. Also, you'll get a presentation today from Jeremiah Johnson, MPH, PrEP4All's executive director, who's led the organization's fight for a national PrEP program, building on a proposal from a novel approach to PrEP financing and delivery. He co-drafted in 2021 in partnership with Johns Hopkins University. After they go through their presentations, thank you for dropping our emails in the chat. After they go through their presentations, then I will go over some questions based on the questions you all submitted when you registered, and then we will open the floor up for other questions and answers. So let's go ahead and welcome Christopher Morton to talk more about the U.S. versus Gilead case.
Thank you, Michael. Can everyone hear me? I hope so. Thank you so much for having me. Michael gave me a very kind and kind of formal introduction. As Michael mentioned, I'm a lawyer. I represent PrEP4All pro bono. I have for many years now. I'll also share I'm a gay man. I am a PrEP user since 2019 and have been honored to do the work that I do with PrEP4All for many reasons. But this is one of them. And grateful. I know that there's lots of folks from HIV/AIDS patient community here today. So thank you for coming. Thank you for the work that you do. I'm going to talk to you about the United States versus Gilead case and share some of the kind of history and predictions about the future of the case. And then I'm going to pass the mic to Jeremiah to talk kind of more in context what this case means for the community and the future of HIV care. Let me share some slides. My PowerPoint has been acting up a little bit, so I'm going to try to share in this form so I can see the slide numbers along the left side. Can folks see Michael, give me a thumbs up if you're seeing. Okay, all right. I think this will work. Of course, there's tech glitches on the day of the webinar. So I'm going to try to speak for about 20 minutes. Here's a quick roadmap to what I plan to cover. I want to kind of introduce the case in just a few minutes and explain the theory and goals of this litigation, why the case matters, big picture, and then introduce the appeal and talk about why the appeal matters. The appeal is the stage that the case is at now. Then I'm going to spend more time, give a longer history of US v. Gilead, explain how we got here, and focus on the role that PrEP4All and other HIV/AIDS patient groups and community groups played. Then I'll talk in more nuts and bolts detail about what to expect in the appeal that's ahead. And then I'll say a little bit about how folks in HIV/AIDS advocacy can get involved, and Jeremiah will say more about that. So that's a roadmap of what I'll be discussing. Let me start big picture, as I said. So this is a case fundamentally about recouping public investment, US taxpayer investment in HIV PrEP. On screen is a snap of a New York Times story from 2019 when the government first brought this case. As this headline kind of indicates, it was the US government, it was taxpayer-funded laboratories that first invented PrEP. It was researchers at CDC that did the first animal studies to show that PrEP could work. It was the NIH that did and funded the most important trials to prove that PrEP actually works in humans. So PrEP is really a triumph of public science, and I think a triumph of American public science especially. And the American public, I think, has a right to demand some return on its important and large investment in HIV PrEP. So that's one reason I think this case is important, and it's kind of a theory of the case. The government, when it brought the complaint back in 2019, talked about this. There's more to this case, which is that Gilead, the defendant here, is potentially liable for a large amount of damages. Could be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The government sought over $1 billion at trial last year. So the money that could be paid by Gilead to the government is money that could help build a better future. PrEP4All, I know, is excited about this case because a victory here, payment from Gilead, could create a pot of money that would help create and support a national HIV prevention program, or at least a pilot version of it. And one more reason I think to kind of put this case, or one other way to theorize this case is to say, Gilead, as I think a lot of folks on this call know even better than I do, has been, I think, a bad actor in the HIV/AIDS space. It's charged outrageous prices for its medicines. It's broken promises to patients. It's lied to Congress. It's been a bad partner of CDC and NIH and other parts of the US government. So this is not the kind of case that the government would bring against every big drug company. This is kind of an exceptional case against an exceptional drug company. I have a quick slide here. This is an advocate story. I forget when this is from, I think 2019. Kind of emphasizing the role that PrEP4All played in instigating this case, and also showing PrEP4All's theory of this case from the very start, that we want licensing revenues from Gilead to fund an expansion of HIV care, especially prevention care. Okay, so that's a little bit of the theory. Let me tell you now in like a couple minutes what the appeal is and why it matters. So this case, US v. Gilead, was brought in 2019. In a second, I'll explain more of the history. It didn't go to trial until last year, until the spring of last year. And unfortunately for the government, Gilead won a big victory. The jury in the case sided completely with Gilead. So the government got no liability, no money owed by Gilead to the government. But the government has kept fighting, and I'll say more about that too. So the jury verdict is not the final word in this case. The case is very much still alive. The government is still fighting, and there's a chance that the government could win on appeal and get a new trial, and win a large amount of money from Gilead. So that's another thing to stress, is that I think a lot of the reporting last year suggested that this case is over. That's not true. This case is very much still alive. And a great story about the appeal is Ed Silverman's in Stat News from just last week, I think, talking a little bit more about the status of the appeal and the stakes of the appeal. Okay, so let me then turn to the history and explain how we got here. I said earlier that it is that HIV PrEP is a triumph of public science, of government science, and that's true. On screen are a couple key publications from US federal agencies, from the CDC and the NIH. So the CDC did the early animal studies. And I think it's fair to say, at least in the government's telling and in my understanding as well, it was CDC scientists who really kind of believed in the possibility of HIV PrEP. There had been others who had tried to use treatment meds for HIV prevention, as folks on screen probably know, but nothing worked into the 2000s. And it was folks at CDC who got the idea to try the emtricitabine tenofovir combo, and they did animal studies that were really promising. And they filed patents on those discoveries, which will be important in just a second. And NIH took the emtricitabine tenofovir combo and put it into clinical trials and showed that it worked in people. So CDC, as I mentioned, got patents on its early work in animals, filed those patents in the 2000s. The patents actually made their way through the patent office and became legally enforceable patents in the 2010s. I think around 2015, getting now. And my understanding is the CDC sort of quietly started talking to Gilead. Of course, in the meantime, between the 2000s when CDC did the research and 2015, Truvada was approved as PrEP. PrEP became a commercially significant product. And the government approached Gilead and said, look, we invented this technology. We got patents on it. We think that you should take a license to those patents. As I understand it, those discussions sort of went on quietly in the background in the 2010s. Didn't really attract much public notice until 2018, 2019. It was in 2018, I think, that PrEP4All first learned about the existence of CDC's patent on PrEP and more patents to come. We started looking at these patents together, and we realized that these are scientifically important patents, and they may be legally and economically important patents. It looks like Gilead is using the technology described and claimed in these patents to sell, at that time, Truvada, and making hundreds of millions, billions of dollars off the drug without paying a penny back to the government, to the CDC, to the people who did the early research. So we, PrEP4All really, but I helped in early 2019 sort of helped to break this story. And there was a high profile story in the Washington Post from March of 2019, all about these patents and the role of the government in creating these patents. And you can see a quote from James Krallenstein, one of the founders of PrEP4All, kind of talking about how we wanted the government to assert these patents to recoup the taxpayer investment in PrEP, and reclaim some money from Gilead that we can use to expand care. PrEP4All did a lot of work in 2019 to kind of raise awareness of these patents and advocate for the lawsuit that would become United States versus Gilead. In early 2019, the Department of Justice sort of revealed that it opened a review of the patents, so maybe was looking at a litigation. There was this terrific story in The Advocate. I think I clipped this this quote before. In May of 2019, the House Oversight Committee, then led by the late, great Representative Elijah Cummings, held a whole hearing on HIV PrEP and who invented it and Gilead's profiteering on the drug. At the hearing, we saw the then CEO of Gilead, Dan O'Day, testify. We also had Aaron Lord, one of the co-founders of PrEP4All, testifying right next to O'Day. There was even more, and I'm kind of, I think, Jeremiah may enrich the story further. But basically, PrEP4All and other patient groups were making more and more noise about these patents, but we weren't sure what the government was going to do. So I was surprised and honestly really pleased to see in November of 2019 that the US government, that the Department of Health and Human Services, which contains CDC, contains NIH, that HHS decided to bring a lawsuit. And of course, the lawyers, the kind of litigators for the federal government, the Department of Justice, got involved as well. And so it was Department of Justice lawyers litigating on behalf of HHS, litigating on behalf of CDC. This is a clip from the press release in November 2019. I think this quote from the press release is a great one. Gilead's received billions in revenue from HIV PrEP. HIV PrEP is invented by HHS researchers and patented by the US. This lawsuit demonstrates the department's commitment to protect the government's intellectual property and hold accountable those who seek to unfairly gain from the government's research without paying reasonable royalties as the law requires. In some sense, what's happening here is that the government is being, as aggressive as Gilead and other pharma companies are about asserting intellectual property rights. Gilead may complain that it doesn't like this lawsuit, but this is the kind of lawsuit that Gilead brings using its own patents all the time against pharma competitors. So I'm trying to scan the chat. I'm not doing a perfect job, but I do see a question. If the government were to win money, what guarantees are there that those funds would be used to increase access to PrEP? This is a great question. And I'm glad to talk more about it in Q&A. But I will jump ahead, actually. We know from kind of a couple different sources, including the trial itself, that the US government has promised to use any proceeds from this case to expand HIV research and expand HIV care. I pulled a clip here from John O'Merman, who was one of the witnesses who testified at the trial. And he said, any damages from this case would be put back into CDC's programs, its research, to implement strategies that improve the nation's health. So it's a key concern for me. I would not want the government to win $1 billion and then buy like a stealth bomber with it. But the government has made a commitment to use any proceeds for HIV care. I mentioned before that this case went to trial last year. Patent litigation is extremely slow. It's complex, it's expensive. So it took 3.5 years for the case to get to trial. The trial, as I said, was unfortunately, in my mind, a total loss for the government. The jury sided completely with Gilead. I won't get too deep into the weeds of patent law, although I'm glad to answer questions about the specific patent kind of issues, the claims and defenses of folks who are interested in that in the Q&A. But I want to tell you kind of there are two key legal issues at the trial, two really important ones. One is validity, whether the patents are valid. If a patent is invalid, it can't be enforced. It's not worth anything. If a patent is valid, it can be enforced potentially. And those who use the patent without permission may have to pay royalties or other kind of compensation to the patent holder. The jury here, or Gilead, had alleged that the government's patents on PrEP are invalid, or the asserted claims at least are invalid. And the jury agreed with Gilead. The main argument, or I think the most interesting, most important argument, is that Gilead suggested that it was not new, and was in fact not new, and it was also obvious to use the FTC TDF, the emtricitabine tenofovir combination as PrEP, even as early as 2005, early 2006, to say that there's really nothing new here in the government's patents that were filed in 2006. That kind of argument Gilead had tried to make before against these patents, and it hadn't succeeded. But in this trial with this jury, that argument did succeed. There was the other really big issue at trial was infringement, the question of whether doctors who prescribe PrEP, patients who use PrEP, and Gilead, as it instructs doctors and patients on how to use PrEP, whether they're infringing the government's patents. The nuances here are quite complex, glad to say more in Q&A, but the punchline is the jury found that there was no underlying infringement by doctors. So those were two key issues that the government had to win, this validity and infringement issue, and the government lost both with the jury. But as I said, that doesn't mean that the case is over. So the trial occurred in early May of 2023, last year. Right after that, PrEP4All, along with its partner, the Public Interest Patent Law Institute, a civil society group, and I think like 24 other organizations, including, I suspect, many of you on this call. I know Public Citizen joined, like a whole bunch of access to medicines and civil society groups and HIV/AIDS orgs came together to urge the government to keep fighting. We wrote to the Attorney General and the Secretary of HHS and sort of reminded them of the stakes of the case. And urge them to keep going. And happily they did. They continued litigating, and a big breakthrough occurred earlier this year when they successfully convinced the judge who oversaw the trial to set aside, to essentially undo a part of the jury verdict. So the government convinced the judge in Delaware to undo the portion of the jury verdict that had to do with infringement. So that's one of the two key issues. The judge declined to disturb the jury's verdict on validity. So the jury verdict that the government's patents on PrEP are invalid remains intact, at least for now. But this was a big step closer to a win for the government. And kudos to the government's lawyers for continuing to fight and for winning on this critical issue. So that was a step in the right direction. And then the next big step in the right direction is that the government's decided to appeal this case, and the fight will continue. I'm going to turn to that appeal in just a second. I'll just say that the news of the appeal is really new. We just learned this month that the government will appeal. It filed a notice of appeal that confirms that the appeal will happen. So this is big and exciting stuff. This is kind of one of the most critical moments in the whole long history of this case. So let me then turn to the appeal and tell you a little bit about what to expect. This appeal is going to go to a different federal court called the Federal Circuit, or the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. This is basically a federal court that sits between the trial court, where trials happen, aka the district court, and the U.S. Supreme Court. In between those two levels is an intermediate court system called the circuits that take appeals. And this particular circuit, the Federal Circuit, focuses on patent cases and a few other kinds of cases. This is an appellate court that has the power to overturn decisions of lower courts, including jury verdicts. So there's a chance now, the government wouldn't bring this appeal if there were not a chance of undoing the jury's verdict on invalidity or on validity. So what could happen now is that the Federal Circuit agrees with the government that the government's patents are valid, or at least are not invalid for the reasons that Gilead argued to the jury. And what would probably happen then, it looks like, is the case would go back down to the trial court, back to Delaware, and we could get a brand new trial. And the government have a new opportunity to present its case, and the government could very well still win. As I mentioned before, the government sought $1 billion in damages. I don't know that the government would press the same damages claim if it got a second trial, but we are definitely talking about a lot of money here. The timetable for an appeal, we know from some kind of activity in the court docket that the government's brief is currently due September 10th. That could change, that's not guaranteed. For example, the government or Gilead could seek extensions, but I think it's likely that this appeal will get briefed this fall. I can't guarantee, but I think it's likely we'll have an argument in this case in 2025. And we'll get a decision from the Federal Circuit, from the appeals court, sometime after that. It could be late next year. It could even be 2026, as maybe crazy as that sounds. Litigation, as I said, is not only expensive and complicated, it also tends to be very slow. One thing to note here is while litigation is still going, and this appeal would take months, if not years, to resolve itself, there's always the possibility of a settlement that Gilead and government lawyers could sit down and hammer out a deal. We just saw, for example, Gilead settle in one of the litigations that's pending over TAF, I think to the tune of $40 million with and I forget the specifics there if it's one of the tort cases, but basically we know that Gilead's lawyers sometimes settle these cases. And so one possibility, and I think a really promising possibility, honestly, is that the government has fought closer and closer to a victory now, and it's teed up this appeal. And hopefully government lawyers are talking with Gilead about a way to settle this case and take this litigation and end this litigation in a way that is satisfying. Gilead might not agree to pay $1 billion, but it might agree to pay some amount of money that's really valuable to CDC and helps fund the important programs that Jeremiah will say more about. So the short version there is just this litigation may not grind on forever. We may see a settlement. Okay, I want to close with a quick thought. This was just a quote from me underscoring that the government could still win here. This is from the Stat News story about the appeal. As I said to Stat, the jury trial last year went badly for the government and went very well for Gilead. But things that have happened this year have gone better for the government and not so well for Gilead. So the momentum may be on the government's side right now. Okay, let me close with just a word on kind of reconnecting to the HIV/AIDS community that really helped kind of create this case and talk a bit about how folks can get involved. Again, I think Jeremiah is going to say more. Remember that this is a case brought on behalf of the American people. The government's press release from 2019, its complaint even, talk about that. This is an unusual case. The government doesn't sue companies for patent infringement very often. To my knowledge, this is the first and only case like this. It's really an exceptional case. And the government brought this case in part because of Gilead's sort of bad corporate citizenship. But it also brought this case because the government is in, I think, a uniquely good position here to vindicate the public interest, to recoup public investment that's been so critical in the history of PrEP, and to fund really important HIV programs. So for all those reasons, I think this is a case that that patients should be interested in and should be part of. So there are ways to get involved. One thing that interested members of the public can do in litigation is file amicus briefs. These are briefs of friends of the court that share perspectives with the judges deciding a case, perspectives that might not otherwise get heard by those judges. So if you're interested in submitting an amicus brief, you could feel free to contact me. I have a network of lawyers. Some folks may be able to help out. That's one kind of formal and time-consuming way to get involved in this litigation. Another way, honestly, is just to get the word out about it and kind of raise public awareness in the patient community and more broadly. This case got tons of attention in 2019 when it was filed, and then another blip in 2023 with the bad jury verdict. But I think there hasn't been so much press or community attention since then. And this is an opportunity now that the momentum seems to be on the government side, now that the appeal is going to happen very soon. And given that, hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe $1 billion hang in the balance, I think this is a great time to remind the world about this litigation, to keep encouraging HHS and DOJ to keep litigating, to make sure that whatever deal, if they settle, to make sure that whatever settlement deal they cut with Gilead is a really good one, focused on expanding care in the places and ways that are most needed. I think I'll stop there and turn the mic over to Jeremiah. Glad to answer questions in the Q&A. And thanks again for having me.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. Jeremiah Johnson, Executive Director at PrEP4All here, and grateful to be part of this conversation. As Chris said, we're excited to be able to re-highlight this case. A year ago, I think we were not sure, if this would have additional momentum within it, which would have been a shame, after all of the advocacy that has gone into this. And the promise that it holds for community in terms of equitable PrEP access, and holding a company accountable that has, as Chris put it, been a bad actor in our space for quite some time, and in particular on PrEP. The fact of the matter is that Gilead enjoys an outsized presence in our entire movement. They dominate HIV treatment in the United States. They have, until recently, dominated the PrEP space. They are set to dominate it again in the near future with lenacapavir and promising results from that. They have infiltrated all of our community finances at every level to such a degree that they enjoy an enormous presence in our movement at all levels. So rarely do we get to have a moment to really press for a better deal for our communities. And the fact of the matter is that this is a company that, I'm not really these days in the pharma greed kills sort of camp and everything. Gilead is a company that is intended to make a profit. It is underregulated, and so that's what it will do. The only times that we see any sort of benefit to our community, when we see a better deal for our community, is when we go and press for it. And this is an opportunity, a strategic moment in our movement for us to re-energize ourselves, really re-elevate the awareness of this case, and see it through as much as we can to make sure that the money that comes out of this case ultimately is reinvested in our communities and equitable PrEP access. So that's my somewhat longer than intended opening. I'm going to share my slides. Let me see here. I think that is not the right one. Sorry, one second. There we go. All right. So some of this Chris has already covered, so I'm not going to belabor the point. But just wanted to show in another sort of way, a more densely text-heavy sort of way compared to what Chris had up. Just a brief timeline of how this story has gone down. to reiterate the point that community advocacy has been part of this from the start all the way until now. And the reason why that's important is because, as Chris pointed out, we are hearing from government that any funds that come out of this case will be reinvested back into HIV in general. We are arguing and have been arguing as an organization, particularly under PrEP4All's founders, James Krellenstein, Krishna Arutya, Dr. Aaron Lord, Peter Staley, and all the way to now, for a national PrEP program for un- and underinsured individuals to be in the mix of the conversation. And we have been beating that steady drum the whole time, all the way from 2018, when PrEP4All was founded, and I was not part of it at that time. I was a fan from afar at Treatment Action Group. But they took that momentum and that visibility to unearth these government patents that Chris has been talking about. Then connected with Chris and other patent law experts to test the validity of those patents, ultimately leading to a report coming out in March of 2019 that was also cited in a Washington Post article. Advocates helped use that proof of the patent validity and its value to the government and to community to go to Congress and call for them to investigate more in terms of what is the story of PrEP, who really does own this innovation, and why are we getting such a raw deal for it? Ultimately seeing the House Committee on Oversight and Reform pulling a panel together to have that conversation, including Gilead CEO Daniel O'Day and PrEP4All co-founder Aaron Lord. That ultimately led members of Congress to ask the Government Accountability Office to investigate why the Department of Health and Human Services had not enforced these patents against Gilead. It also caught the attention by August of 2019 of the financial community, and the Financial Times conducted its own analysis of the potential value of these patents to the government and by proxy value to the community, assessing that at that time, based on PrEP sales, that the government could reasonably claim 1 billion to possibly even 3 billion in damages at that time. Community advocacy was part of all of that. Ultimately, all of that visibility, all of that advocacy, getting all of these stakeholders involved led to that November 2019 outcome with an unprecedented lawsuit coming from the Department of Justice on behalf of HHS, suing Gilead for infringement of those patents. As Chris put it, patent law is slow, takes a long time, but we have been part of the conversation ever since then, including by January of 2022, where PrEP4All sent a sign-on letter to the Department of Justice, along with 24 other organizations, calling for greater transparency in the case in order to understand what had been going on, and also reiterating again that any funds derived from the case ultimately would need to be invested in a national PrEP program for un- and underinsured populations. As Chris put it, last May, we didn't see it go the way that we had hoped, but we have continued to press, again, sending a sign-on letter along with the Public Interest Patent Law Institute and 32 other organizations, pressing for DOJ to continue to press this case, because the stakes are just too high for the government. The stakes are too high for community. And as Chris put it, it is still a winnable and strong case for government, and something that we believe that they should continue to press. So all of this to say, one, to sort of reiterate and help everyone sort of track the timeline, because there were a lot of moving pieces, and Chris and I both agreed anything good hearing is worth hearing twice for those purposes. But also just to make that point that we have been here throughout, community advocates have been here throughout, and so wherever this case heads, it's important that that continues to be a central focus in where things go. So before I get a bit more into some of the potential stakes for community in this case and where these funds could potentially go, I do also want to provide a couple of reminders Because the fact of the matter is that Gilead, as I said, enjoys an outsized presence in our field, meaning that around this case, around any advocacy related to drug pricing, anything that goes against Gilead's sort of commercial interests, we're going to hear other narratives that come out. And we know what some of those narratives are going to be. But Chris and I, amongst others, we've been casually perusing publicly available documents from these cases, as one does, really lighthearted, not dense at all, to try and sort of see what are some interesting points, what are some things that we have found out through all of this trial litigation that is relevant and important as we hear some of these counter narratives that are going to be coming at us from Gilead. And one thing we're going to hear is that this is, a burden on Gilead, that this is something that is going to be difficult for them to handle, and that it's unfair to them. And I think it's important for us to remember that Gilead is wealthy beyond what any of us could even possibly imagine. It is so much money that we can, it's impossible. I think sometimes as community advocates, we hear a number that sounds big to us because we're working at a community level. And so those dollars would matter a lot to us as an organization, as a movement. But to Gilead, this is couch change. This was something that was really even further apparent in the documents that we have been looking at. Gilead makes an enormous profit on PrEP. The margins on PrEP compared to manufacturing cost compared to their overall operations are enormous, and they actually do better even compared to generic companies, even though they are charging much higher prices. They make hand over fist in terms of absolute dollars, in terms of profit. And a government analyst actually, in one of the cases that we have been looking at, found that Gilead had earned at least $10 billion on PrEP alone just between 2015 and 2021. We're now in 2024, so they've earned even more since that time. But that's an enormous amount of money that they can work with. Again, the types of damages that they could potentially face in this case are nothing compared to what that money would mean for us as community. Another government analyst in the Delaware case estimated that if Gilead were to pay a 4% royalty on what they had earned at that time, they could still keep over $8 billion. If they paid a 10% royalty, they would still keep around $7.67 billion. Enormous profits that they would still, be able to weather, even though that would give us a better deal as community and give us a better chance at getting PrEP to everyone who does not have access right now. And we know that Gilead is already paying these types of royalties on other products. That was something else that came up in these cases. So this isn't foreign to them. This isn't different. We also know that CDC has used these same PrEP patents to charge royalties against generic manufacturers. And so a question for us is, why should these patents be valid and apply to generic manufacturers, but not to Gilead? And so we believe that this is, again, a case for a just outcome on multiple levels, and that really holds Gilead accountable and doesn't allow them to be some sort of unique outlier in terms of PrEP manufacturers. We're going to hear from Gilead that any sort of penalty that they experience is going to chill research and development. But something that is clear within these documents is that Gilead is not investing a large percentage of its profits back into research and development. A government damages expert looking at Gilead's own financial records indicated that it spends on average just somewhere between 4.9% to 10.6% of its profit on research and development, and it did so between 2011 and 2020. By comparison, there was an analysis in the LA Times back in 2017 that noted that Gilead actually spent probably around the equivalent of 100% of its 2016 profits on stock buybacks and dividends. So we really need to ask the question here, when Gilead says those sorts of things, can they really not afford it? We think that it's pretty apparent that they can afford it. And that money would be much better invested in equitable PrEP access. Will it chill research and development? It doesn't seem like Gilead is spending that much on research and development compared to what it's spending on just helping make itself more wealthy and making its shareholders more wealthy. And at the end of the day, which matters more to us as an organization, the wealth of Gilead shareholders or equitable PrEP access and ending HIV in our community? I think that's pretty obvious to all of us here. So those are some important points that we want you to hold on here. The other thing that we're going to hear is about how Gilead has been such a great champion to the community around PrEP. And something that's very apparent within these publicly available documents is that they have not been a champion on PrEP. They have been at best a reluctant partner over and over and over again on multiple levels. Where we have seen progress is where government pushed progress and where community pushed progress. And it's important for us to remember that that's going to continue to be the case. We're not going to see Gilead give up anything that it isn't compelled to give up. So on the research front, we know that Gilead was reluctant on research, contributing, again, by government estimates, a mere $1.7 million in the equivalent of medication donations based on manufacturing costs to original CDC PrEP research. By contrast, recent analysis has estimated that the government invested around $143 million in PrEP research. Gilead's intransigence around PrEP research actually impeded progress, and this was noted repeatedly within these publicly available documents. And so it really goes to beg the question, who really put the effort in and who took the risk in developing PrEP? And I think it's very clear that it was the government, it was American taxpayers, and it was the individuals signing up within those trials and the researchers. They were the ones who invested so much more in PrEP development. And so for Gilead to benefit so handsomely, but be so unwilling to pay back even a small percentage to help contribute toward PrEP, equitable PrEP access seems incredibly unfair. And certainly something that we need to be questioning here. When it came to having an evidence base established for PrEP access, we then knew that the FDA would be willing to approve an indication of Truvada for PrEP. But even here, Gilead fought against that. Ultimately, FDA had to go to Gilead and tell them that they were unethically harming patients for not seeking an indication for PrEP. So as much as Gilead wants to talk about being a champion, the FDA had to drag them in to actually get this PrEP indication. Once they had the indication, they didn't want to promote it. Greg Alton, Gilead's former chief patent officer, is on record within the case saying that the company resisted promoting PrEP because they didn't want to interfere with the commercial business on treatment, which is a rather cynical sort of take on exactly Gilead's interests in terms of all of this, and something that I find personally alarming to hear come from the company. Another bit of government testimony said that an unnamed Gilead employee did not want to promote a drug that could be associated with unprotected anal sex. Thus, a company perhaps feeding into the stigmatization of our communities and our sex. And so the question again is, who is Gilead a champion for in all of this? Ultimately, Gilead did become a champion of PrEP, of course, but that was once they saw that there was commercial benefit around PrEP. And even then, there was some reference within testimony that the commercial sector of Gilead continued to lament that the treatment market grew at a slower rate as PrEP was being scaled up. Again, something that seems very cynical to me. And then all the way through to this case, Gilead has continued to resist. And around US v. Gilead, there was a lot of evidence within these documents showing that Gilead has been putting pressure on government officials using their own personal relationships with them to drop the case, saying that pressing it forward could have negative consequences for industry-government collaboration. So, you know, the reality is community advocates have pressed this case. Gilead deserves this case to come at them. They can afford it. That money could do so much more for community, and Gilead has not been the hero here. And it's something that it's important for us to all carry forward as we talk about what would be a better deal for community and what can DOJ be doing. And then once we get those funds, what can government do to right these wrongs of what we've seen within our communities? So I'm going to touch base briefly, and I'm probably going way over, but what are the stakes here for community? The reality is that we are in a difficult time within our movement. Largely due to Gilead's price gouging around PrEP, we continue to see enormous disparities in PrEP access related to gender and race and ethnicity. The fact of the matter is that it's mostly white cisgender men that are getting access to PrEP within the United States. That is endangering our ability to end HIV as an epidemic overall. The fact of the matter is that we are way off from our government target of bringing down new infections by 90% by 2030. And if we miss that mark by the long shot that we may miss it by, I fear what will happen. What is that message going to be to policymakers about the value of continuing to invest in ending HIV as an epidemic? And the challenge there is that we may see an epidemic that ends only for white men and no one else in this country. PrEP is the key to get us back on track. I'm not going to go in depth into the image that you see here, but there's recent analysis coming out of Emory showing that for jurisdictions on the left there that have done a poor job of scaling up PrEP access, that they've continued to see new diagnoses increase within those jurisdictions. Compared to those that have really scaled up PrEP access on the right, we have seen precipitous declines. This isn't surprising. We haven't moved viral suppression in the US for at least 7 years. We've only moderately moved knowledge of status within the US. PrEP is that way to move forward. And so our success in this case, the funds that could come out of it, a national PrEP program means so much more than even just the justice of this case. It actually is a moment, a shot in the arm for our movement, and a moment that we absolutely need it. And the fact is that HIV funding in general is under threat. As Michael was referencing in his opening remarks, we are continuing to see attacks on HIV funding in general by House Republicans. For fiscal year 2024, we saw Republicans calling for $767 million in cuts. Advocates fought back and we managed to get that turned around, so no cuts went through. But now we're hearing those same calls again for FY25. That makes it incredibly difficult, not only for us to protect our own ground that we already have, but to come up with the sort of innovative programming that we need for equitable PrEP access. This is something that could make a difference in terms of all of that. We're also under threat within our community health centers by Gilead in terms of funding, because in 2021, Gilead decided to pull a 180 on community health centers and reduce their reimbursement under the Advancing Access Program to 340B entities, cutting profits by at least $100 million a year, probably way more than that to community health centers, further undermining our ability to get equitable PrEP access out there. Gilead offered us a Band-Aid to the problem that they helped create in 2019 when they gave a so-called tax-deductible donation to the government for the Ready, Set, PrEP program. But that program has not been successful, serving certainly less than 10,000, probably far fewer than that individuals in the US each year, compared to the 200,000 individuals that they had been hoping would access it, that the government had been hoping would access through that donation. So the reality is that we need better infrastructure for a national PrEP program. And I should say that program failed specifically because it was not designed well, and Gilead showed enormous inflexibility around the donation. And we know that we can build something better. We need funding for us to build something better. We have the evidence base, we have the knowledge on how to build something better, but we need the funding to come through. And so this case means so much more, particularly within the context that we are in right now. So this is pretty much my final slide, and then we can jump into the Q&A. But we know exactly what these dollars could do if we got them tomorrow. We know exactly what to press for. And the reason why is because community has been doing its homework. So this case is one part of that broader narrative, but we've also been doing everything we can to understand what should a national PrEP program for un- and underinsured populations look like. Ultimately leading to the publication that you see there on the left in 2022 in a special edition of the Journal of Law, Medicine, and Ethics, where we discussed a national PrEP program that could uniquely eliminate cost as a barrier to community members who are struggling to gain access to PrEP. Also, I should just say, I see the chat is going on. I can't see any of that right now, so apologies if I'm missing anything. We will get to that. We were successful via this proposal in catching the attention of the Biden administration, who for the last 3 years has been calling for such a national PrEP program. They've been calling it the PrEP4All to end the HIV epidemic plan. And the notion behind it is that with a reasonable investment, we could eliminate cost as a barrier to all PrEP-related services for un- and underinsured individuals. We could dramatically expand touch points to PrEP prescribers and communities, including through leveraging teleprep. There's no reason in this day and age that we can't turn an LGBTQ center or an intimate partner violence center or a homeless shelter into a place where someone can access a provider. This is something that we have seen successfully scaled up in places like Iowa, for example. We want to see what we could do if we can expand that to other places around the United States. We also need better campaigns by and for community, and importantly, campaigns that don't just endlessly raise awareness of PrEP, but that immediately provide people with a pathway to equitable PrEP access, something that immediately tells them exactly where they need to go. We need that level of convenience. We need that level of intuitiveness in terms of access, and that's exactly what we could fund with royalties off of US v. Gilead. So the amount that President Biden has been calling for is $9.8 billion over 10 years. So even what we could get from Gilead in this case wouldn't go as far as we need. We still would need Congress to act. But if we got that money tomorrow, we could start to build that foundation. We know that we could create a central mechanism for a PrEP pass that could easily cover generic PrEP medications, labs, and provider visits in an easy to download or print out intuitive way where people take that PrEP pass, go to their pharmacy, go to the labs, go to their provider, and that same mechanism provides access to them in a way that makes this incredibly simple for them. It could also help set up infrastructure that would allow us to meaningfully move forward a conversation about equitable access for long-acting injectable formulations as well, something that's a bit more complicated, particularly as those are so much more expensive, but it can move us in the right direction. Also, community has been calling for a pilot initiative with these different components underpinning it. And just yesterday, we finally saw an announcement coming out from CDC about that pilot initiative. Right now, it's only able to look at 4 jurisdictions, but with more funding, we could do so much more. And we could get that out even further and make an even stronger case for a national PrEP program and congressional investment. Importantly, we also like to point out that this isn't just about PrEP as well. We've had difficulty getting other innovations out to HIV-negative individuals in our community, most notably in 2022 with Mpox vaccinations. Then Deputy Director of the Mpox response in the US, Dimitri Daskalakis, frequently said that he knew what to do for HIV positive individuals in that situation because we have that infrastructure, because there are programs that already exist. For HIV negative individuals, it was much more difficult. So this is infrastructure that could be built to help increase not only access to PrEP, but innovations like DoxyPEP, Mpox, syphilis treatment, any number of things for our community. And so that's what's at stake for our community. And that's why it's so important that we press as hard as we can to get a better deal for our community after all that we have sacrificed and engaged in around equitable PrEP access and around PrEP research within our communities. So I'm going to stop it there and just offer a few ways for you to stay involved. The fact of the matter is as Chris said, we don't know what the timeline is here. So we're going to have to see what ends up happening. But we do invite you to sign up for our email list at our website there, so you can keep on top of everything. As Michael pointed out, we don't take pharmaceutical funding in case that isn't already obvious. And we do that because we want to be able to be an independent voice on all of this. And so we really do depend on individual donations, small donations, large donations, repeat donations. And so if you're inspired by this work or want to help get involved, that's another way that you could really help support us, as well as helping to connect us to other individuals who might be interested in helping to fund this work. And if you're with media, want to find out other ways to help elevate this work or have other inquiries, you can, of course, email me or Michael at our email addresses on the screen. And with that, I think I went way over, but I think we've got some time for Q&A still. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Jeremiah. And I've been making note. We've got a lot of questions in the chat. And also we got some questions that people sent when they registered. So I've been kind of taking those notes and going to pose the first question to Chris. Do we think the government has a strong case in this appeal?
Short answer is yes. It's really hard to predict. The key issue on the appeal, I think, is going to be the validity of these patents. I mentioned before that Gilead had tried and failed to knock out these patents. They tried at the US Patent and Trademark Office. Actually, a different company, Mylan, the generic, also tried to knock out the kind of European version of the CDC's patents on PrEP. And they failed too. So, the jury verdict in Delaware, sort of the first time that this kind of validity challenge against the CDC's PrEP patents has succeeded, and it's a little bit of an outlier in that regard. So all that is to say, I think that the government's basic position on the validity of the patents is strong. One tricky thing, though, is that the posture of this case is such that the government lost at the district level, lost at the trial, got a bad verdict from the jury. That makes it harder for the appeal court to undo what the jury has done. So if we were starting from scratch, I'd say I think the government has a really strong case. Because the government has to defer, the appeals court has to defer to what the jury found, the government faces taller odds. But I still think this is very, very winnable for the government.
Thank you. And one of the preliminary questions that we got for Jeremiah, and I'm going to tie it to a question that came up several times in the chat. First part of the question is, how can the HIV communities support in the US v. Gilead case when so many organizations and advocates receive funding from Gilead? And the second part of that question, which came up a lot, what are some questions we can ask the Gilead reps when they visit our clinics to hold them accountable?
Thanks for that, Michael. So, I think something that I try to be really careful about these days is to acknowledge the complexity here. Let's just be honest. A number of historical foundations funding HIV/AIDS services and funding policy advocacy have ceded ground to Gilead, quite frankly. They've allowed Gilead to really take over as a significant funder in this space. And so that leaves organizations in a really complicated place. And so however self-righteous I may sound in some of my comments around some of these things, I think that, as marginalized communities too often are forced to do, there is having to sort of navigate, a number of barriers in terms of trying to serve the communities that they're trying to serve. I think different organizations are going to be able to do different levels of things. One thing I will say is, if you are able to engage in policy advocacy without having to take Gilead funding in order to free yourself up, it's a bit of a lonely space out here for PrEP4All. And so I think where we can talk about that, where we can have conversations with funders to come back into the space, to understand the unique importance of PrEP, not just to HIV, but to queer health in general, to overall sort of public health responses, get them into the space so that more entities might be able to be funded without having that Gilead sort of Damocles over their heads. I think that would be something that would be really important. But for those who aren't able to do that, and let's face it, it's complicated out there, do what you can. The fact of the matter is I personally don't believe that you have to take Gilead funding and then let them control your narrative. I think that you can have a barrier. You can come up with ways to still press back, to still put out information. If you absolutely feel like you aren't in that position, though, you can come forth and talk with PrEP4All off record. We won't out you to Gilead, and let's brainstorm what we can do. How can we support each other here? At a minimum, don't carry Gilead's water for them. Don't become their mouthpiece. That's something that's incredibly important. And you know, I think one of the challenges that we see here is that Gilead has effectively used its sort of funding influence to kind of coerce different organizations to kind of advocate for their agenda. And I think it's important that we especially safeguard against that. When it comes to engaging Gilead reps, I think that's complicated. The reps that we interact with Gilead, they're not people who have pricing power. They are strategically positioned in order to sort of keep us quiet and to be very nice people that we get along with. And they're not people, and they tend to look a little bit more like our community than Gilead's C-suite does, let's be honest. And so, like, we are not going to get very far with them. So I think to that end, I think conversations can be good. I think they can be helpful. I also think that it's important to save our energy for those moments when it's most strategic. And I think it's better to join in on larger sort of policy conversations, helping to support this conversation at a higher level, helping us support bringing that conversation directly to the people who do make pricing decisions at Gilead. And to save our energy even more so for that, because as community liaisons, it's complicated and they don't really even have the power to change that.
Thank you, Jeremiah. I have another question for Chris, actually two questions. What does this mean in the context of long-acting injectables? And how can a win in this case lead to equitable PrEP access? And actually, the second part of that question, I think either of you can touch on.
Sure, I'll start with the first one. The patents that the CDC holds and has asserted here really cover oral PrEP only. They were filed, as I said, in the 2000s, and the compounds under study then were, were FTC, TDF. And the scope of the patents is, I think, something that the government and Gilead have kind of disputed, but I think from the government's perspective, at most these from the government's perspective, these patents cover Truvada and Descovy as PrEP and the generic forms of those drugs. I don't think the government has any claim that its patents would cover lenacapavir, say, or cabotegravir, or any injectable PrEP product. So the short answer is these patents are not a tool that the government could use to kind of control or discipline or shape pricing of injectable PrEP. The longer answer might be that the fact that the government is going toe-to-toe with Gilead over Truvada and Descovy and trying to recoup some of the many billions of dollars that the government that Gilead has captured. The fact that the DOJ and HHS are still fighting shows that they have some backbone, and it shows that these agencies might be willing to use other tools in their arsenal to try to bring down the price of lenacapavir PrEP, let's say, if and when that's approved. So I guess this is to say this case itself and these patents don't directly affect the price of injectable PrEP, but the kind of the strategy of the government and the willingness of the government to stand up to this company and the support of community advocacy that all of you are doing, that will affect, I think, what happens in the next fight over injectable PrEP, if that makes sense. It may not be a patent infringement suit, but other kinds of executive policy actions exist that could be used to lower the price of lenacapavir PrEP when we get there. Michael, I'm sorry, I forgot your second question. I forgot to jot it down.
How could a win in this case lead to equitable PrEP access?
Jeremy, do you want to jump in on that? Because I feel like you have better vision at the program.
Yeah, sure. So, and to build on a little bit of Chris's last point also, this case, these patents aren't directly able to help us in terms of, lenacapavir in particular. But our vision, and this ties into the second question here, is that these funds from this case, along with everything else that we're pressing right now for congressional investment and use of existing funds, is we can build the infrastructure for equitable PrEP access, leveraging one of our best sort of advocacy cards right now, which is that we do have really cheap but high quality generic PrEP available right now. That is an excellent option for the vast majority of PrEP users, less than $20 a month in terms of access. So with us being able to take the enormous price of PrEP off the table, we're able to have different conversations with policymakers. If we come to the table with royalties from a case like this, we really can talk about building that infrastructure. And once you have that infrastructure, that gives us a different positionality in terms of being able to talk about equitable scale up of other innovations of PrEP. But we have to start with sort of step one. And step one is we've got to be able to leverage the affordable PrEP options that we have now. And then we can talk about how we can build from there. But the reality is it's just complicated on the long-acting injectable front until we are in a position where we can negotiate a public health price. Just noting that lenacapavir for treatment right now is around $42,000 a year in terms of list price. So that's, that sets us at a disadvantage. Cabotegravir, Apretude, it's $23,000 a year. And so I think it's important. Yeah, Chris, to your point, I'm HIV positive, by the way. I didn't say that at the start of all of this. My partner's on PrEP. But part of my advocacy is I am on generic TDF FTC as part of my regimen. So that's just how I operate. I'm very happy with it. But I think, we need to continue to elevate that as a tool in order for us to be able to get into more of a conversation of equity.
Thank you. And another question that came up both in the chat and in the registration, while we make sure he's still on the call. Yes, Peter, co-founding board member, Peter Staley, co-founding board member of PrEP4All. What is the status of other HIV Gilead cases?
And there are a bunch of them, and it all gets very confusing, and people confuse them all the time. But beyond US versus Gilead, there are two categories of other cases. I've been a part of one that was initially called Staley v. Gilead. That was in San Francisco federal court. There was an a federal antitrust case that was more focused, while we included the TAF delay as part of our initial claim, it was more focused on misbehavior by Gilead and other pharmaceutical companies around keeping generics out of the HIV treatment market, especially one pill once a day treatments. We lost, and that got broken into two trials, two cases. We lost the first case, very similar to US versus Gilead, where a jury just couldn't get past the complexities. And that was last year. That is being appealed to the Ninth Circuit, although I'm not very hopeful on that. And the second part of the case, I think the various classes of claimants are looking at possibly negotiating an out-of-court settlement, given that they lost the first case. I'm going to get an update on that on Friday. The more interesting cases right now are the personal injury class action cases, the TAF around the TAF delay, and that's where Gilead has settled one of them out of court, and but there's one that's also in front of the California Supreme Court right now, examining this very novel look at whether a company can be sued for delaying the introduction of a drug around claims of injury caused by that delay. And we are waiting for the California Supreme Court to pass judgment on whether that can proceed on that basis. And that's kind of the update. We're basically, we're not having great luck in the courts. We're getting outpunched by the deep-pocketed law firms of Gilead, in a sense. Chris?
Yeah, can I jump in on that point? Something I could add kind of more color around the United States versus Gilead trial, and echoing what Peter just said. We've talked, Jeremiah laid out some of the incredible, like the fabulous amounts of money that Gilead has earned from HIV PrEP and from its other products. This is one of the wealthiest, most powerful companies in the world. Consistent with that, it's hired an army of lawyers. And at least in the US v. Gilead case, it's hired lawyers at Wilmer Hale, which is one of the nation's kind of top and most expensive law firms. At the US v. Gilead trial or through the case, it looks like Gilead had a multiple, like something like 3, 4, maybe 5 times as many lawyers on the case as the government had. DOJ is obviously humongous, but DOJ does not have a huge number of patent lawyers who know how to bring this kind of case. So one kind of explanation of what happened at the trial last year is that DOJ just got overwhelmed by the army of lawyers that Gilead threw. And Gilead has dragged the government into a side litigation, a breach of contract litigation, which I haven't really gotten into, but just to say Gilead's really thrown the book. They've used their money to buy lawyers who have made this case and other cases as difficult as possible for the plaintiffs that are trying to hold the company accountable. I will just say to Peter, it's been disappointing to see some trials, I think, kind of some juries side with Gilead. But the fact that Gilead just settled that case for $40 million with patients who allege that they've been harmed by Gilead's choice to delay development of TAF, is a clue that this company is ready to cut deals and that there's some fire here. It's not just smoke.
Thank you. And we did have a wrap-up time of 1:15, but we're going to stay on a little longer. I had one more question that was in the chat, and then if people want to stick around and ask some more questions. But just before we wrap up, do want to thank everybody who joined us today and stayed on for the full hour and 15 minutes. But let's keep the conversation going. So one question that did come up was, if the appeal in US versus Gilead is not successful, how could a national PrEP program be funded? And something that I saw that came up multiple times in the chat also was, if the appeal does go through and we win, how do we make sure that that money is going towards PrEP access?
I'll jump in there, and thanks for everyone who's still hanging on even past the hour and 15. And thank you, Michael, by the way, for the great facilitation. We really appreciate it. So other ways to fund it, we'll have a lot of bake sales and lemonade stands. No, we are asking. We have been working diligently with the Biden administration to keep the request within that administration's budget request to Congress. Now, where we're going to be left, after the end of this year, I think we're pivoting and strategizing on all sorts of different fronts. But we're also very engaged with congressional offices to have conversations about whatever we can do. The Biden proposal is for a mandatory funding proposal, which is a little more complicated, particularly because you're going to see a lot of opposition probably from Republicans for a 10-year, nearly $10 billion program that has to go through authorization. So we're also looking at discretionary funding to see what we can get right now. We have an ask in front of Congress for a $100 million investment in building a foundation for a national PrEP program for those same things that I talked about in my presentation, that that funding could go toward a PrEP pass, could go toward a pilot. Those are things that we could do with more funds right away. Congress is complicated, of course. So in all of these situations, we're just going to keep pressing. That's what advocates do. You know, they're the times when things are moving really quickly. They're the times when things are difficult. We have to keep going. You know, I can't help but say with Peter Staley of all amazing people here, you know, I can't imagine how hard it was to do this advocacy during some of the darkest times of the epidemic and continuing to show up. And so I feel like it's very important that whatever we're facing, and the presidential election, with Congress, with massive pharmaceutical companies, we've got to keep pressing, and we have to stay true to our communities. And so that's what we're doing. And we're fighting on every front, and we are having wins. There's going to be a pilot from CDC. We're going to see what else we could do with other existing funds, but you know, it's definitely a matter of making sure that we're pressing on all fronts headed forward.
Thank you. And we still have about 60 people on the call, so I'll open the floor if anyone has any other questions. And you can drop it in the chat, or you can come off of mute and let us know. If not, Jim, do you want to wrap us up? Oh, I'm sorry.
We actually have a late breaking scary question from Tim Murphy. Go ahead, Michael.
Yes. Wait 1 second, it's scrolling too fast. How open to all of this do you think second Trump administration will be? Ooh, that's a doozy.
Thanks, Tim.
Can I say a first word and then give Jeremiah the harder part of the question? Just to say, I'll remind everyone, this lawsuit, the US v. Gilead lawsuit, was brought by the Trump administration in late 2019 when Trump was still president. And Alex Azar was then Secretary of HHS. Like, these are not folks who, I don't know what I need to say, but like, these are not folks you might think of as like progressive or friends of the LGBTQ movement or the HIV/AIDS community, or like even that sort of willing to go toe to toe with big pharma. So it's like all the more remarkable that advocates convinced the government to go to court in 2019, given who was running the government in 2019. And Trump actually made hay out of this case and holding Gilead accountable. Like Azar was giving quotes to NPR, I think, about the litigation. And I recall at least Trump saying something about this case as proof that, you know, he's willing to fight on drug prices. So there's some evidence to think that like this is a case, at least, that a Trump administration would continue to press and continue to believe in. There's a second piece of the question, which is like, you know, can we be sure that the proceeds from this case and that other money would be used to build out the national HIV prevention program? And that's, in my mind, perhaps a harder question, and that's what I'm going to punt to Jeremiah. Sorry.
No, thanks, Chris, for that. And thanks, Tim Murphy, for being so Tim Murphy about it. No, that is you. You know, we've been having some conversations, and the reality is that it's impossible to predict anything with that particular camp. I mean, it's just such a volatile, you know, sort of individual heading a volatile group. And so I think it's hard for us to know exactly. But to Chris's point, I mean, there's this constant debate going on about who got the deal on the insulin cap. You know, there's very much appetite on, you know, amongst all sorts of different political ideologies for pharma to be reined in. To Chris's point, do we know if that money would end up going back to a national PrEP program? I think that those are open questions. So I hesitate to predict what that means. But to Chris's point, there are good signs for us to continue to press, though, however, because the Ending the HIV Epidemic initiative that came under Trump, he was the one who announced it in 2019. This case came, you know, under Trump. There are still, you know, sort of signs that this is, you know, a presidential candidate who would be open to pressuring, sort of a pharmaceutical company. So it's certainly not one of those things that we should just give up on. I also hesitate for us to like overly try to read the tea leaves right now because it's just too unpredictable, but just to be prepared and just to keep sort of pushing that as we move forward.
Can I make one last quick point on that score, which is just CDC and the government, like DOJ's lawyers have sort of committed themselves in this litigation to the position that proceeds from this United States versus Gilead case will be used for HIV research and care. So, it's a promise. Whether the Trump administration will respect the promise may be a different question, but I'll just underscore what Jeremiah said. Like, this is a golden opportunity for this community, for advocates to kind of hold the government to its promise here, and remind the Trump administration, if, and like, heaven forbid, but if we're stuck with it, then yeah, remind the administration of the promises made in 2019 and that have been made through this long litigation.
You're on mute, Michael. Oh, there you go.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Any more scary late breakers?
I see something about a dispassionate observer. Tim,
Who is that? I mean, maybe Tim can give us some ideas of who that could possibly be.
Yeah, I mean, we can mull that over. I don't know. I tend to surround myself with passionate observers, so it's hard to not go immediately toward those. But let's touch base offline, and we can see if there's maybe someone who's more of just sort of a political analyst that might have some additional ideas.
And Jim, do we want to go ahead and, is there anything you want to
Yeah,
add?
I think I think we'll move into the wrap up. So I want to say thank you to all of our participants. We had well over 200 register. We know a lot of times people register. The timing isn't always great. So everyone will be getting a copy of this recording in the next couple days with the slides, with the resource documents. So thanks to everyone who showed up live. And thank you to everyone who registered as well. Huge thanks to the team who put this webinar together, Michael, Jeremiah, and Chris. Absolutely fabulous. It was a pleasure for the Choice Agenda to host this. We're always happy to help amplify these really important issues and activities. And I think there was a lot of excitement and engagement in the chat. So please make sure, if you are not following PrEP4All or not on their email list, go to those links that we've dropped in the chat oodles of times and follow up and get on their list. And also, the Choice Agenda covers this stuff, so you can be on yet another list. There's just so many lists in so little time, but they're all important. So in the next couple of days, you will all receive emails with the follow-up. And I hope to see folks on August 5th, when we're going to be talking about the inclusion of people with disabilities in prevention research and programming. And as I don't need to tell any of you, we don't include people with disabilities very well in prevention research or programming. It's an enormous field. People with disabilities is not just one group of people, it's many, many, many groups of people. And it's super complicated, but it's something we need to be really addressing when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We need to also be thinking about people with disabilities as well. So with that said, I'm going to officially close the webinar. Thanks again to Chris, Jeremiah, and Michael. Thank you, Peter, for coming on for a guest starring role. And thank you, Tim Murphy, and others for scary and important questions. Have a great day. Thank you so much.